Hi everyone, how are you doing today? My name is Aryan Chaudhary and I'm joined here with my hosts Akash Vikram Shroff and Parth Behani. Welcome to the Zoom In Zoom Out podcast, where a couple of us woefully underqualified friends zoom in and out at the stories of our very qualified and interesting guests. We love discussing compelling ideas, concepts, and even the journeys of these people with those people and amongst ourselves. We also like to talk about systems for personal growth and improvement, and like to think that we're kind of like productivity nerds. So I hope that we can all stay happier and have more fun in our respective growth journeys.
But before we begin, you might be wondering, why should you listen to us? And if the sound of our voices hasn't done it already for you, I don't think anything else will. As Aryant mentioned, we're woefully underqualified. We have no idea what we're saying, but the guests we have on are going to be pretty interesting, and we've been through some stuff ourselves. But on a more serious note, I think there's a slight chasm between what is represented of people and their actual journeys and how they get there. And I think representing that journey better and trying to help people understand how someone can actually get to where they've gotten helps you realize that people are a lot more alike than you might think. You might think someone is extremely smart and extremely qualified, but it took them a lot of hard work to get to that level. And therefore, you should listen to us to get a little more perspective and a little more insight into ourselves and the wonderful guests we have on, plus the concepts that we address.
Thank you for that introduction, Akash and Arihant. I think you covered most of it. The only thing I'd like to add is that we realize whenever we see successful people, we often see where they've reached now, or what's the big thing they've done, or what they've accomplished. But it's really rare that we go in depth to see where they didn't work, where they failed. And that's what we'd like to bring you, right? That perspective into the numerous occasions where they would have failed, and more importantly, the systems they use to learn from that, to overcome from that, that we can use ourselves too. I think let's start with short introduction. I'll just go first. I'm Parth Vihani, as Ari mentioned, and all three of us have taken a gap year from college actually. So we graduated last year and going to be starting this year. I'm going to UC Berkeley, and I'm really interested in pursuing robotics. Uh, Ari, would you like to
Uh,
go next?
Yeah, thank you so much, Parth. I'm a 19-year-old student who graduated like last year, like Parth said. I'm really interested in CS and environmental design, although I think it feels like I've changed what I want to do with my career like a million times already. I like to think that I want a purpose with my education. Right now, it's to surround it to tackle global critical issues, and just help add more meaning to people's lives. I'm really interested in climate change, so yeah, that's a little bit about me. Akash, about you.
Thanks. My name is Akash Vikram Shroff, and I'm going to be studying CS at Northwestern University this fall. I really enjoy problem solving, and I think that's why I'm quite inclined towards CS. I like automating things, but to be honest, I spend hours trying to automate something that takes about a minute to complete manually. So I'm not very
Same,
good at
same,
that. But
same.
I'm always armed with a cup of coffee. And just in general, I love hearing stories and learning new things. And I love hearing about how people who didn't succeed and what they used in order to succeed. So I'm gonna start us off. I think the introductions are very apt here. So just as an open-ended question, is there any time that y'all didn't succeed? Or what's one time that y'all failed? Parth and Aryant.
I don't think I've ever not failed while starting a task. I think both of you know this. Even with this podcast, I think this is officially our second episode. The first episode shouldn't be there on the internet. So yeah,
I
I
think
think
the less the people know about the first episode, the better it's going to be for the remainder of our episodes. Let's just say that's living in a bloopers reel somewhere.
Yeah. So I think like about like failing. I'm at this point that I've just based my my learning on the whole concept like learning by failing. And that's basically the mindset of like starting on and working on something new, and you just give in to like the possibility that you're gonna fail. You know that you're giving your best. You're trying not to fail because that's not the goal, but you kind of like just give in that like subconsciously you know that you're probably gonna fail, and that's going to be like something which helps you push forward. If that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to you guys. Like, can you guys agree?
Yeah, I totally get what you mean. And I think, um, so we've all obviously heard about how failure is important in growth, right? But I think that one thing that I realized that I used to think before was that you often only fail when you're starting something new, right? When you're beginning, when you're starting something new, and then you might fail and learn from that. And then as you become successful, you'd probably um, not fail as much. And that was something I think a lot of us also think about or have this just preconceived notion. But that really changed for me when I started following SpaceX because their entire philosophy was even at reaching the point at which they are, right, the biggest rocket launch provider in the world, their entire philosophy is built around failing, right? Like iterating by failing. Like instead of taking 10 years to plan a new rocket, they do it in 2 months, build it, try it, and if it doesn't work, they go for the next one, right? So it's not just failing when you're starting out, like a podcast, but also just taking that journey through you, no matter where you are, and learning from those mistakes, which um, I think could be really powerful.
Yeah, I think that's really important because you have to understand, or at least understanding the idea that failure can come regardless of your competence, because failure really depends more on what you're trying to do than how much you've already done or how much you already know. And that's a hurdle that people have to get across, that even if they think they're good at something and they fail at it, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not good at it. It just means that there's a lot left for them to learn, which is entirely fair because there's a lot left for all of us to learn in almost every field. And I think personally, I've encountered failure obviously a number of times, and when the three of us say failure, we don't really mean any sort of life-ending failure, but it's more of a hurdle than anything else. So I run this student breast cancer awareness organization called All Pink, and I've been doing it for a couple of years now, roughly 2.5 years. And when we started off, we had to encounter a large number of hurdles. I'm sure you can imagine there's a bunch of 16-year-olds trying to go around educating people on a very stigmatized topic like breast cancer in a country that's slightly more conservative, India, where socially and honestly across the world, socially, breast cancer is not given as much importance as we would like. But so we were starting off, we were trying to get people to understand what breast cancer is. We had organized this screening camp where we tied up with the company to provide underprivileged people access to free, low paid screening. And we went onto the road, we were trying to get people because not enough people knew about the camp. So we were like, oh, we're doing breast cancer screening. It's free. Would you like to get yourself tested? And we were trying to explain to them the importance of breast cancer. And the funniest part is that whoever we spoke to on the road, about half of them didn't know what breast cancer was at all. They were just like, what is breast cancer? I've never heard of it. There's no such thing. The other half were completely apathetical. They were like, oh, you know what? I pray, nothing will happen to me. Oh, you know what? I eat this, nothing will happen to me. And they didn't even want to get themselves tested, even though it was free. Generally, in in India and across the world, when something is free, people leap at it. And here we had a situation where we were giving free medical testing and nobody wanted to avail the services. Now, naturally, there's the entire part of children speaking about it. I'm sure if a doctor had approached them, the people might have been more receptive. But it's about like that failure, it could have totally derailed our progress and it could have totally put us off the idea of trying to make people more aware. But I think all that it did for us, thankfully, at that point, even though it was disheartening, I will agree, it made us realize that there is a lot of scope and there is a lot of requirement for improvement, that there's a real issue here that has to be tackled. And in that sense, failure served as a very poignant indicator of the success that could be achieved. So the number of people we encountered who didn't know about breast cancer, that didn't tell us, oh, people don't care about breast cancer. It told us, oh, there are so many people who are waiting to know about breast cancer, who have to yet be told about breast cancer. So in that
Yeah.
sense, I think failure can be really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you spoke about there, Akash, really takes me back to this one book that I kind of like read. Uh, it's called The Unfair Advantages, I think. And one of the ideas in the book is success is fair play, which is basically hard work, into unfair advantages. So even if you're like putting in like really uh, amazing amounts of work that like I've seen you do with All Pink, there's also like the unfair advantage portion that we kind of like leave out when we kind of perceive our own failures. So let's say for you guys, your unfair disadvantage was that you were like a bunch of 16-year-olds or 17-year-olds, right? And a doctor's doing the same stuff would have the unfair advantage of being a doctor, being somebody who's taken seriously, at least in a very stigmatized and really weird society that we have to deal with a lot of times. So yeah, it's really interesting to sometimes think about how you can shape your perception of failure to to like set yourself up for like success. What do you have to say about this? Like, do you think it's important to care about failure
Um,
perception as much?
Yeah, I think in that sense, at least tackling what you said about the unfair advantage, I just want to again reiterate that the fact that people would listen to a doctor isn't inherently unfair, because that would make sense. That's sound medical advice. Please do that. If there's a bunch of 15-year-old kids and there's a doctor, I'd pick the doctor myself.
I
But
mean,
I,
yeah, like again, I don't mean to say that being a doctor is an
Aryan, there's a
unfair
bunch of
advantage.
lawsuits coming your way very rapidly.
Dude, I mean,
No,
unfair advantage in like the large context.
no.
Let us begin with like
Yeah,
another
yeah.
story.
No,
Let's
No,
not
no.
talk
I
about this.
I
Yeah.
totally get what you mean though about the unfair advantage idea, right? I don't know if a lot of you might have seen this picture. It's kind of like a meme where there's a fence, right? And there's three people. There's one tall person who can see over the fence just by virtue of how tall that person is, right? Then there's someone shorter who can't see over the fence, and someone who's the third person's even shorter, right? And the idea was of equality versus equitable distribution of like resources and help. So in the equal case, everyone was given one stool, right? And with that one stool, the tallest person could still see over the fence. They would anyway being able to see over the fence, right? So they had like the analogy of having the opportunities and so on. Then the middle person, because of the stool, was able to see over the fence. But the shortest person, in spite of the stool, was still too short, right? So even if you give people equal resources in some ways, by virtue of many other factors, you might not be able to get that same success in the same way. Versus when you have an equitable distribution, in that case, the shortest person got two stools so that everyone came to the same height over the fence. So there is definitely this idea of success being dependent on a lot of factors. I think the important part about that is that if and when you fail, it's important to be aware of how it happened and why it happened, and not be completely like heartbroken about it, but learn from it and figure out how you can get to that next step to reach where you want to reach. Right?
Definitely. I entirely agree with that idea, because I think the connotation of using the word unfair advantage, which is why I'm not particularly fond of that phrase, is it puts you in the mindset of, oh, I can't do something because it's inherently unfair. Like I'm inherently disadvantaged to it, and there's no way I will be able to overcome that advantage. So I definitely think that, again, in the Alping situation, a doctor would have an advantage of credibility or ethos.
Yeah, but
But
that
in the
would be a
same
fair
way,
advantage. Yeah,
yeah, that would be a fair
yeah,
advantage. And in
yeah,
the
yeah.
same way, uh, us trying to combat the failure that we had would require us to recognize that, oh, you know what? Maybe these people aren't interested in listening to 15-year-olds. So how can we bridge that? Well, why don't we go to doctors, get them on board, get them to see if our idea makes
Yeah.
sense to them, if the Niramai
Yeah.
technology makes sense to them, and then they can promote it. So
Yeah.
it's about understanding where you're lacking and trying to bridge that gap. So
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
but definitely.
Yeah. Again, sorry to all the doctors listening. By unfair advantage, in this context, you definitely have a very fair advantage. That was just
Aryan,
the
quite bold of
formula
you
that
to
I
assume we
stole.
have listeners.
uh, Sorry, guys, if you have left, please come back. Parth is calling you. uh, but yeah, I think also this thing which kind of Akash mentioned right now, about how failing can motivate you into like achieving success, right? Now success is very subjective. It's how you define your success, right? Again, my success, like my limited success in my life, hasn't been like life transforming, not for myself or for anybody else. It's just been like here and there, just being happy sometimes. But yeah, about failure motivation. What do you guys think? Like, does failures act as a source of like immense motivation, or is it more demotivating? At least for you guys.
I think it varies a lot, right? Obviously, when you fail at something at first, you're going to be sad about it, right? It's natural to be disappointed. It's natural to have wanted more, and it's fine to have those feelings. But using that to motivate yourself is the part that's harder, right? But if you're able to make that bridge, then you can turn it into this fuel that lets you overcome that step. But I think making that switch or like crossing that bridge is the part that takes more work than anything else. And yeah, I'm guessing you would have both experienced that as well.
So,
Uh,
in this context, in terms of failure being a motivator, I'd like to take a slightly different approach. And I've spoken about this a number of times, but there's this filmmaker that I really like called Matt Diavella. And he speaks about this concept of something called a two-day rule. And
Mm.
the purpose of this two-day rule is to sort of take motivation out of the equation entirely. Now, failure in some circumstances can be entirely demoralizing, where you're just like, oh, why did this happen to me? I can't believe this happened. When you set your expectations high, and then it all comes crashing down. And at the same time, it can be extremely motivating as well. You're like, oh, okay, I failed, but next time I'll get it. But the issue with that is it's very unpredictable. And the highs and the lows can affect you equally negatively because you'll have a high, you burn out, you have a low, you're stuck in a rut, you can't do anything. So what I like doing is trying to take motivation out of the equation entirely by following this two-day rule. So what this two-day rule effectively states is that if you have a certain task that you want to get better at, or something that you've been meaning to improve but haven't been able to, say for example your health, and the task is going to the gym for half an hour a day. So the two-day rule says that even if in some situation something external comes up, something you miss one day, no big deal. Just don't allow yourself to miss a second consecutive day. You cannot miss 2 days at a time. So that helps you be more accountable not only to yourself and to the goal, but it helps you build like a steady foundation by consistently incrementing the number of gym sessions you repeat. So if for some day you miss a session because you're injured, regularly that might be a very demotivating thing where you're like, oh, I've missed a session, I've lost all my games, that's it. No, I'm
Yeah.
now going to be very I'm not going to be able
yeah.
to lift the same amount of weight that I could before. So instead of having that either demotivate you into missing an entire week or get you to push yourself insanely the next day that you actually get injured, it's about, oh, I missed a session. It's fine. Doesn't matter. I can't miss tomorrow. So I have to go tomorrow. So it's about changing that mindset. And I think that approach has helped me immensely in a lot of things that I do. What do you all think? How do you all still like to use failure as a tool to motivate yourself, or do you find that it leaves you either in a high or a low?
Uh, Yeah, so I think the whole concept of motivation. I think firstly, failure is a huge source of motivation, but again, motivation is really weird, right? Because it's easy to sometimes like procrastinate a task by just saying that I'm not motivated enough to do it, hence I will not do it. And I don't really like that idea of like having motivation in your equation, like needing that extra motivation to begin, or like just give yourself some extra force, like just begin a task. So I think I heard it on one of the many YouTube videos on productivity that I've binge watched this past year, about taking motivation out of the equation, like I think Akash said, and treating motivation as an end product of what you're doing. Let's say I want to learn, let's say, a new programming language, right? But if I'm cribbing about it in a lot of ways by saying, okay, I'm not motivated enough to do it, I don't want to learn Python or something like that. That there are more chances, at least that's what I think right now, of me not doing it this way. Instead, if I just like take it as a non-negotiable that I need to learn Python, or like get some inspiration from Akash's 2-day rule. Okay, I couldn't do Python today, but because I'm a huge preacher of and practicer of, I don't know if practicer is a word though. Don't use it in essays, guys. um, um, uh, so of the 2-day rule, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna make sure I do it tomorrow. And I think it's beneficial in a lot of ways, to get motivation after you do your session tomorrow, so you feel motivated enough to like do it the third day or the fourth day, right? So motivation can act as an end product and not like something which goes into the left side of the equation. What do you think about this, Parth?
I mean, I totally get what both of you are saying, right? The idea of having a routine when you're trying to do things so that motivation isn't something that's day to day. But there's just like one distinction that at least makes sense to me, right? In your day to day, when you're trying to do something like be it workout or be it learn something new, then not having motivation in that equation, but rather making it a habit which you enjoy, which you can keep doing, is something that can definitely and does like work a lot better. But I think a point at which it's important to still, if you have like a big failure event, right? Like not a single day of missing something, but a big event. Maybe it's like a big competition you lost or something you didn't get into or whatever it may be, right? I think after that point is when it's more important and harder to not be demoralized. And at that instant, that keeping, well, I don't know if motivation is technically the right word, but keeping your um, spirits up that you can keep doing this event and you can keep sticking to your, be it the 2-day rule or be it whichever routine you've made for yourself. So that's like the only slight distinction that I think, at least in my experience, that I've faced.
I think that's very true. Like a larger setback is more likely to derail you than a smaller setback. In a simple sense that intuitively makes sense. Um, I think in that sort of a circumstance, it might be a little easier, or at least it has helped me, to realize why you started doing
Why you're
something in the
doing what you're
first place.
doing. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And once you figure that out, then you sort of the end product, obviously they're all it's very enjoyable if something goes your way. But even if it doesn't, if you still realize why you're doing something, then you might begin to enjoy the journey enough that the end product doesn't really matter. And I think
yeah,
that's quite important if you want to have any sort of sustained attempt at something. But
yeah.
entirely, a large setback does have the ability to derail you, so you have to be wary of how you let that affect you.
I think about a large setback motivating you into doing stuff. It just reminds me of my gap year story in a lot of ways. So I think as like my co-hosts would know, I don't know how many people know this, but it's I'm going to Berkeley this year, but the year before this, before my gap year, uh, I actually got rejected from almost every college that I applied to. And at that time, it seemed like a major setback because it's actually it's justified to feel that you don't have direction when you don't get into college and you're just a high school graduate, um, like who doesn't know what to do with like a whole year because you can only apply for the next
Yeah.
cycle in the coming fall, right? I think just being put in that position just helped me derive so much motivation to, like, not mess it up this time, because I could in that situation, after identifying that I had failed and really not wanting to be there again after a year, or even like through the year, I could really focus, or like zoom into those things that I messed up at school, which I didn't want to mess up going forward into my career, or even that gap year that I was in. So I definitely think that failures can be motivating, but the reliance on motivation is again pretty sketchy. Uh, but
But
again, yeah, yeah. What are you
so
saying,
in
Akash?
terms of Aryan's gap year, what I found really inspiring about it, because I remember last year receiving a number of phone calls from Aryan being like, dude, I didn't get in. I was like, oh, it's fine, man. It's fine. Some college will work out, some college. And then by the end of it, it's okay. Didn't get in, it's fine. But the good part was that at least in my eyes, you didn't let yourself fall into the self-pity rut that, oh, it's not
Yeah.
fair, it nothing is working out. And I'm like, to be perfectly clear, feeling bad for yourself is okay. It happens. It's very natural. Like, some things didn't work out, you are going to feel bad for yourself. But letting that entirely consume you, even though it may be a hard thing to stop yourself from letting it consume you, is something that's very necessary for you to do. Because if you fall into the self-pitying rut of, oh, nothing is going right for me, nothing is ever going to go right for me, then that's just going to compound your issues even further. So within like a week, I remember Aryan he was doing like a million internships, he was doing a million courses on Coursera and everything. And it was
Yeah.
really heartening to see, because he was taking this gap year by the scruff of the neck, and it was really working out for him. And it did work out for him. I mean, you're going to Berkeley now, so quite
Yeah.
clearly something went right. But I think this idea of taking accountability is very important, and it's something
Yeah.
Yeah.
that everyone should do. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
sorry to cut you off there, Parth, but I really don't want to lose my train of thought
Go ahead.
right
Go
now.
ahead.
It just reminds me of this book again. I hope this time this book analogy is not messed up. It's called The Obstacle is the Way. And it talks about Stoicism, where you take accountability, and you base your well-being like, one of the concepts of Stoicism is that you base your well-being on like the stuff that you can control versus not like the stuff that you can't control.
Hmm.
So you base your well-being on stuff which is entirely into, like let's say, if I'm working towards learning Python, let's say. So basing my well-being on I'll be an expert Python programmer at the end is a really weird goal to have, because I can't control I can't control being an expert, like based on the definition of expert, right? Or let's say if I have a number goal for a school grade, let's say I want to get an A plus by the end of the semester. That's not entirely in my control, because it also depends on the answer that I produce, how it matches with my professor's expectations, as opposed to, let's say, I will devote 2 hours into this, or like I will follow the 2-day rule, or I'll just be disciplined with my work. There's a higher chance that I'll be happy producing my work and just following this, than like just basing it on the number goal and then expecting let's say if I have this goal, right? I'm working 2 hours every day, so at the end of every day I'm somewhat happy, and as opposed to the other scenario where I'm basing it on a letter grade or a number grade at the end of my semester. I'm waiting to be happy, and God forbid that doesn't happen. Then it just leads you into this kind of a failure cycle where you have, like, you can indulge in self pity. Sometimes it might not work well for you. So it's also about, like, I think the book, coming back to the book, it spoke about identifying and like shaping your perception of failure first, then the action part of it, which I just said about the stoicism, and also the willingness to accept that a lot of things are not in your control. Like, there may be external elements that just may pop up in your journey to achieve a certain success that you defined for yourself. there's so many things that can happen that probably you can't control, right? Let's say our gap years, like we couldn't control COVID. I don't think a lot of the world can control COVID right now. What do you have to say about that part?
Yeah. I think there's also like a balance, right? You need to get. Obviously, it's really important to not be stuck up about things that are not in your control, and as you said, do what you can to the best of your ability. But when things don't go your way, I think if you keep going, like continuing with that line of thought, you'd often start blaming those external things and say, oh, it didn't happen because of this, right? But the moment you do that, you're going to stop your growth again, right? So like Akash was saying, after using this, like after this initial phase of not being stuck or not focusing on things you can't control on, it's still important at the end, if you fail, to take accountability of everything that happened, right? Because the moment you do that is when you can start doing the next thing. Like I'm sure for your gap year, right? You were able to do all of these new things because you took accountability and you recognized that, hey, in school, I like fooled around, I messed up, and I didn't have a perspective of like everyone in the world who I was competing with and so on, right? But then recognizing that and using that after to achieve what you did is what made you reach where you are, right? Versus being at that point being like, oh, this is just not fair, this happened to me, like, and being stuck in that. And that, like, having that growth mindset and that perspective is something that I think.
So I fully agree here with Bob because I mean, and Stoicism, if it works for you, entirely excellent. And I really like the idea of trying to focus on the system rather than the end product and trying to find enjoyment in the system because that means you'll actually enjoy what you're doing rather than some arbitrary goal which you won't ever fulfill. But I think the fact is that at some point you have to take accountability for everything. And it's quite counterintuitive actually because you'd assume that if you take accountability for everything, you're just going to end up cursing yourself more and feeling more of a failure and more you'll be in more of a rut. But the weird thing that happens, at least to me, and I'm sure to many people as well, is that when something goes out of your control, that leads to more anxiety and more just constant deliberation on it, which can worsen how you're feeling, how you're thinking. So the idea of taking accountability over everything tries to steer you away from blaming others, as Parth said, and also helps putting things into your own hands. So, for example, say for All Pink, suppose there's a project due, a social media project. So instead of trying to say, oh, you know what, this post is actually that person's job. So if they don't do it, then it's fine. It's theirs. I'm not going to worry about it. And while that is a method that people could take, and if it works for you, sure. But for me, I just constantly be worrying about, okay, have they done it? Have they done it? They haven't submitted it yet. What's happening with the post? So instead, I find it much easier to take complete accountability. And suppose that doesn't happen, I'm like, okay, you know what? It's my fault here. I will just try to be more proactive and try to see how they can fit their schedule a little more. But I think one part about Stoicism that I definitely agree with is if something is truly out of your control, like for example, the college process, although you might try to take accountability of it and try to work as best as you can towards it, you have to not let yourself get disheartened by it. I think that's a lot of what Stoicism preaches by asking for focus on the system rather than the end product. So that's something I definitely agree with. But I still think that taking accountability helps in certain situations, but it entirely depends on the person themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a fine line, and the important thing is in either way to not beat yourself up about whatever happened entirely, because the moment you do that, there's just like this endless cycle of despair that's going on, right? And I think we've spoken quite a bit for today's episode and given you all quite a bit of our thoughts. But going forward, what we're going to be having is different guests from different walks of life who've accomplished amazing things and getting their insight into how they made their way to where they are, how they failed, how they learned, and showing you that perspective, which I'm sure is going to teach us and everyone listening a lot. So if either of you would like to say any final words to end today's
Yes,
episode.
I would. And guys, thank you all everyone for bearing with us. We'll have a lot more insightful people next time. We'll have people studying PhDs at Stanford, leading CEOs, all of that stuff. But before we go, I would just like to give everyone an open-ended question, which we'll be addressing going forward as well. And I want you to think about how you define your own success. This is something that's very interesting, at least, and it might help you do things better and try to work towards goals better. But how do you define your success? How do you know if you're successful at something? And what do you have any targets? Do you have any goals? Is it a system like Aryanth was mentioning with Stoicism, doing 2 hours every day? Is it achieving some sort of competency? But yeah, just think about that. We'll be covering it in depth with each of our guests and with the three of us individually going forward. But yeah, Aryan, do you have anything to say?
No, I 100% agree with both you and Parth about all this. It was really great having you. I hope you come back for the next episode, guys. Thank you, and bye.
Bye.
Bye.